and welcome to our guests. In the order of sitting, László Kupi from the Latin-Amerika Society, Tuki Jencquel, filmmaker, director of this documentary, and Béla Soltész, professor at ELTE University. What I've been planning for this evening is kind of like a 1 hour discussion, out of which I'm going to have a couple of questions, and then we would open up the floor to your questions. So you are more than welcome to put questions to our guests here. And I think my first question would be, I was wondering, I've been watching the film for the second time now, and I've been wondering if you can tell us something about what happened with the participants, the subjects of the movie after filming ended.
Yeah. Yeah, or turn it on. Yeah. Hello? Hello? Okay, so first, thank you for staying. I know it's Friday night and there's probably some other fun stuff to do in town, so thank you all for staying for this. And about the protagonist, it's also a very important question because they've all been struggling in different ways, but Rebecca is dead. The young lady, she died in April, 11th of April of this year, and it was a shock to all of us because she had actually received a sponsorship to go to Italy, and there they were doing a bone marrow transplant that she had to do because the cancer was already in her bone marrow because of delayed treatment, and she could do it in Venezuela. There used to be bone marrow, but it's the transplant center closed down. It doesn't even exist anymore, and it was just too late in her. So the first time it was rejected. She did 3 transplants. The third time she didn't survive, and it was very sudden because until then she'd been fighting. She was a fighting spirit, and I'm very much in touch still with her mom, and her mother is organizing a screening in Italy, and very, very. I got a really nice message from her even today. And Efrain, the young doctor, he came to Europe in March for a film festival in the Netherlands, in The Hague, that's sponsored by Amnesty International. And they invited him, and it was a really very intense week when he was in Europe. But the moment he landed in Europe, and he was picked up at Amsterdam at airport, the first thing he said is, "I'm not going back to Venezuela." So the film festival paid him, they said, "Where do you want to go then?" and they even offered him, could have stayed in the Netherlands, but he said Chile, and then they got him a ticket at the end of the festival. And he's working there. I got a message also from him today, and he's working there as an Uber driver until he can validate his degree. And Francisco, he's in Miami. He's very active still doing what he does and organizing shipments and trying to do activism. But he's also, he's working doing food deliveries and things like that. That's the reality of Venezuelans. There's millions who have fled, and a lot of them are people with higher degrees, and they're just doing anything they can to survive. And in many countries that have problems of their own, especially in the region like Colombia. And then Mildred is in Venezuela. She's doing okay. And we got a prize money this year also in a festival, and with that money we could get her 1 year of medication, bought in Europe, and then we brought it to her. And Rosalia from the pharmacy, she's still living in Venezuela, but she's been able, because her daughter lives in Canada, and she's doing pretty okay. The daughter, she's legalized and she's working as a nurse, so she's able to send her money so she can live with that, and she's also been able to visit her daughter in Canada, so they've seen each other finally.
So what we see is, yeah, it's a lot of individual tragedies, and I think we can also try to kind of make sense in a more macro level as well of what happened, because especially, I mean, in the first 10 years of the Chavez era, we saw a kind of a halving of poverty levels and kind of all these kind of social programs. And so to Béla and László, what went wrong in Venezuela? A couple of, you know, structural causes of the whole problem.
Welcome everybody. Sorry for my English, I try to express myself properly. So the Chavez era was started in 1999, when he was first elected. And yes, the first 10 years were pretty good, because so Venezuela is a special country which has mostly one product to get income, national income, and that's the oil. And Chavez organized the OPEC countries and made the oil price very high. So there were a lot of money, and he started social missions and tried to help the the poor population, the huge poor population in the country. But this one product, the oil, it means that the country is very dependent that product, and I think the situation became wrong when the oil price dropped to the 1/3 of the price. So and a lot of things happened until since then. Chavez died in 2013, but the situation was getting wrong before he died. Maybe in 2012, at the end of 2012. Since then, there is a new government, and the United States, who were very hostile against Venezuela from the beginning of the Chavez era, getting more hostile then, and there is a lot of sanctions against Venezuela imposed by the United States and the European Union since then, since 2015. So it's a hard situation. It's a complex story, but I ask Béla to.
Actually, just one comment before I go on, that before the screening we were just talking outside, and Tuki asked us that if you were in Venezuela, and if yes, in which year. So László said I was there in 2007, and I said I was there in 2015, and he was just saying, okay, I understand. So because the situation was deteriorating to that extent that I would say that perhaps 2015, 16 were the last years when the country was going somehow. And the shooting of the film was in 2016 to 17, right? So it was like the crisis was getting acute, but still not as bad as these days it is. So things are even worse than what we could see in the film. Actually, what was really important is that the oil price on the world markets collapsed in 2013 to 14 from $120 a barrel to $50 a barrel. And in a country which has like 90% of the exports is one single product, if you just have half of the money, then it will have really tragical effect to the economy. And the other thing was the inflation that started to boom. And last year it was 1,300,000%. It doesn't make sense. You cannot imagine that much of an inflation. So I would say that all the money that you have, it will lose 90% of its value in 2 months. So that's the inflation rate that Venezuela is witnessing, which means that money is useless. So with bolívares, you cannot do anything. So instead, you might want to have dollars, or you want to have barter trade in goods. So that's what happens in the economy in general, and specifically with medicine, what happened is that they had a preferential exchange rate for medicine. So because of Venezuela being so much dependent on oil, basically all the money that came from the outside in dollars went to the government, and the government wanted to give it to people for specific purposes. So there was one preferential exchange rate, which was $1 bought you 10 bolívares, and there was one official, and there was the black market rate. And by May or August, I'm not sure, last year, actually the exchange rate collapsed because the official rate was 1 to 3,000, the preferential was 1 to 10, and the black market rate was 1 to 130,000. So that much was the difference, and then it collapsed. It was absolutely unsustainable, and what happened is that until there, it was some sort of preferential rate to buy dollars for those who wanted to import medicine. And from that moment onwards, they could not count with the preferential rate, so this is when the whole thing went absolutely down. But your film was shot even before, so there were so subtle things in the film. When they, for example, they mentioned this sort of low-level corruption at the entry port. For example, they have a container of goods and they cannot make it enter. So it's not only the exchange rate, but also corruption in the lower and also in the higher levels of governance. That was pretty much a problem, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Yeah, and I also think that it's worth mentioning that this kind of dependence on oil is also kind of a historical pattern, which is the goods and the resources themselves change, but the issue of being dependent on one kind of export material in Venezuela, I think it was at the beginning the cocoa and the coffee and these kinds of things. There is a scene, the radio interview scene, where the interviewer says that we are all suffering. And I was wondering, a couple of years ago, I've read a piece in one of the Spanish monthlies, which was on the thousands of very rich Venezuelans families who actually just like moved to Madrid, and they are living in this kind of like very rich barrios in Madrid. So I was wondering, is it true that we are all suffering, so to speak? And if not, who are the kind of the segments of society that somehow can still, cope within this?
Yes. So. I mean, so far the UN estimates is that 4 million Venezuelans have fled. That's 10% of the population. And the estimates are that by next year it will be 8 million. It will make it the biggest migrant crisis since the Second World War. I mean, it will be bigger than Syria, and it's a country that's not at war. So we're talking 1/3 of the population. So yes, you do have people who left earlier, and you have mainly people from the middle class, the technocrats, and people who had like higher degrees or professional, were in some sort of professional capacity and were able to migrate earlier. And then now, the last 2 years, you've seen people who just leave with nothing. They have they don't even have money to pay for a bus ride. They just walk, and you see them. They call them caminantes, and you see them in Colombia. They walk all the way, some of them all the way to Ecuador and Peru, and hitchhike, and a lot of them die on the way, of course. And I think when he says we're all suffering, everyone suffers on a different level. So it doesn't mean everyone maybe goes hungry or everyone dies, but everyone who doesn't belong to a very small elite has suffered. And I think Spain is a very interesting case, what you're talking, like Madrid especially. There's 300,000 Venezuelans who have gone to Spain. And some of them are people who have fled and have lost a lot. And then you have these people who belong to the government elite, basically, or who do business with them, who are called like Boli bourgeoisie, because everything is Bolivarian, everything is based on Bolivar. It's like a cult figure and a cult name. So you just add Boli, and then it's like supposed to be something good if you add Bolivar. So they call them the Boli bourgeoisie, the people who become rich with a so-called revolution. And some of them who are who have charges of very high corruption charges of even billions of dollars. And they're living very peacefully in the Salamanca barrio. And the funny thing is, they know each other. So you have people, they don't speak to each other, but people know who are the ones who, I mean, most people, like, because on social networks, there's people like investigative journalists who post pictures and say this is, and then when information comes out, and some, you know, are school friends, or, you know, it's this intricate web. But now you still have people who are living in Venezuela as if nothing, as everything. The people have, some of them of this very small elite, they have yachts, and they make big parties and drink champagne. I mean, alone Maduro is known that his only French wine he buys every year, 500,000 euros of very good French wine every year for him and his friends. So yes, there are some people who are still doing really well, but I think it's and mainly people also that the great majority are people who belong to the military.
Yeah, so I have a kind of a follow-up to kind of all of you related to this topic. So at the beginning of this year, in January, February, we had this kind of turbulent period with Juan Guaido kind of proclaiming himself interim president, but apparently still the regime is in a sense standing. That's undeniable. And so I was wondering, who are the segments of society or the elite on which still the regime rests?
Yes, I think Venezuela is a very divided country. I see from here, and I think the poor people, the poor people don't trust the opposition and the government too. Already. Chavez was very popular, Maduro more or less, but I think the people can see a real alternative. So in the elite, they see the old regime, and in the government they see the new one, which is not so good now.
Well, maybe you have your own ideas. maybe it's better to listen to you before. I will add my comments after.
Well, I think it's really interesting to hear, like, of course there's, and you're obviously experts on Latin-America and on Venezuela, and I've traveled a lot with this film, and then it's really interesting just to hear what people, how they interpret Venezuela or what's happening, and anywhere from Shanghai to Hungary to New York, and I think probably it must happen. It must be very similar also to what's happening in Hungary, like when what is portrayed about what's happening here in foreign media. Because I think, and I don't know how much it's okay to talk about it, but I think you're also living through your own process of maybe a government that has a certain narrative, and then the people or the press or the individuals who have a different narrative. And I think that a lot of this has to do with Venezuela also. I do think that Venezuela is no longer such a polarized country as you mentioned. I think it was for sure for a long time. And I think when you travel now through Venezuela, it doesn't feel polarized at all. I mean, it's really, really hard to find Venezuelans who still support Maduro. Very, very hard. I mean, yes, you have, mainly in this small group that we talked about, people who obviously benefit and who would have a lot to lose. But other than that, you travel through poor neighborhoods, and I traveled a lot this year still for a different project. And you go to all the extremes. I've been to like rural areas and poor areas and like formerly, and it's really hard to still find people who will openly support Maduro. It's almost like, but the fear factor is enormous. I mean, people are so afraid. I mean, people, there has been protests, but they have been crushed. And I mean, there's one thing, and this is like something that is important to keep in mind, and it's UN figures that have come out this year. There have been more than 5,000 extrajudicial killings. And I have myself talked to someone who used to belong to these death squads that are government death squads, and the way they work. And they pursue people who are basically from the poorer areas, because that's where they're afraid to lose support. If they participate in any anti-government operation or something, they get picked up in the middle of the night, and they're shot in front of their families. And this, you don't have to do this on a massive scale, like maybe it was done in Stalinist times, or in the times of fascism, where maybe they went after millions of people. But you go in one neighborhood and you kill 2 people, and you go to another, and the fear factor becomes huge, and then people will. I mean, it's a society of fear basically right now. So, what do I think? I do think Venezuelans do need fair and free elections. That's a right any society should have, and it will not happen. It will definitely not happen while Maduro is in power. There's no way they will not give up power, because there's just too much to lose.
Just a comment that imagine a country in which basically the income from abroad comes because the government sells oil. So the government sells oil for hard currency, and the government is also selling gold because the country had quite a large gold reserve. So the government is selling the gold reserves to Turkey, to the United Arab Emirates, and to Russia, and it keeps on having inflow of hard currency and also investment from China. In the meantime, Venezuelan companies do not have anything that could be exported, so like middle and popular classes cannot have any sort of earnings from abroad, which is a highly unequal situation. And these higher ranks of power, together with the military, they sort of exercise that sort of power, which is fueled by inflow of currency, and and also because they have this structure of power, which I also agree with László in a way that there is some sort of Chavez nostalgia that might be fading. For 2019, I'm sure that it's already gone. But until maybe last year or 2 years ago, it was pretty much there in the popular classes.
Okay, I think at this point we should open up and so if any one of you has any questions, I have a microphone, I will come to you and then we can continue the discussions. Yes, we have a question there.
Hello. I'm from Venezuela too, so I came with my friend, and it's really interesting to see this kind of like documentary, because I think it's also like really dangerous also to do that in my country, basically because we have the dictatorship. And for this I just want to say something, and it's really important that in all the story we have two opinions. Basically you have two sides of the story, and it's really important that we try to hear both sides of it. Just I'm saying for the, like for example when you told about the sanctions that US is putting in Venezuela and all of that, I think it's good to have like two opinions of this. But basically my question is, how, like, do you think that after this documentary people change their mind or are more interested in knowing more about Venezuela, or do you think it's more than like, you know, it's Latin America, or it's like, you know, like like in, you know, like yeah, this is always happening in Latin America, people die, yeah, corruption, because I have been, like I left my country in 2016, I left Venezuela and I have lived in different countries, and I always have this kind of like picture of people that is, you know, Latin America is always like this, and I just want to know if with this, like, you think that you know, change minds with this.
I guess the question is with me.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I changed minds, and I do think that with a long format documentary where people can see something that is not news, that is not bound to a specific moment, and people can engage maybe with the characters for a little longer and create hopefully some sort of emotional connection, you can make people at least care or think or reflect on something in a way that is different than when you just see something in the news where there's so much happening in the world, and I think there's like a saturation of conflicts in general everywhere. You see so much bad news happening, and then in the end, you know, how much can you really process of all of that? So I do think for me it's been, the film was premiered already in June 2018, so I think it's now coming to an end in the festival cycle of the film, and it's been a really incredible experience for me personally, because I feel like every screen, I feel it's, with a film I can raise awareness one screening at a time. It doesn't matter if there's 400 people in a screening or just 3 people, but every time there's some sort of engagement, connection, or curiosity, and that's important for me. If I changed mine, I don't know. I don't think my role is to change minds, and also I hope that I can sort of cross or cut through the divide of the glasses that most people try to see global conflicts in general, about like a left and right divide, and then when it's like, depending on your ideology, you will judge something a coup or a revolt, and then sometimes it has a lot to do with like what perspective you're looking at things, and then you can give it a, you know, people try to judge things into moral, like the good and the bad, and try to find some sort of simplicity. Once you know a country and you go and you see that the simplicity fades, it becomes complexity, and the only way to know it is if you are there. I mean, I'm sure for Hungarians who analyze what's happening in Hungary, there's much more complexity than any foreigner can understand, and the same happens in Venezuela. And in Venezuela, it's not the left and right divide, because the most important Venezuelan socialists have been against Chavez since the beginning. I mean, the most important Venezuelan socialist and left-wing intellectuals have been against Chavez from very early on. But the international socialist intellectuals have supported because it's far away. It's like sort of there was this socialist utopia that was created during the high oil prices, and there was all this also like some sort of a myth also that was created, but from far away. When you go in close, you see there's much more complexity. And for me, this was a film because that's the country I lived in until recently, where I grew up. For me, it was not about like, is this now left or right? I mean, is this are people struggling? This is what I want to show. I don't want to go. That's why there's very little context in the film. I chose it for a reason. I didn't want to, like, even in Parliament, I didn't want to like label who is who's talking, who is the government. Like, people who know about Venezuela, they will understand, but people who don't, they will just see a bizarre country that is complex, that is going through a very bizarre situation, and that was more important to me. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
yes, we have another question here.
Yes, hello, thank you for the film. I'm Dana Kulcsán, and I don't know the international political background. I don't understand what the US is doing. I don't understand what the Union is doing. So why do politicians not do something or simply deteriorate the situation? We can see that Cuba helps Venezuela. There's the oil, which is a problematic issue. And you said left-wing, right-wing, so is the US protecting itself from the left-wing and trying to usurp the oil? Or what is happening in international politics?
I'm going to answer very briefly and then give to my colleagues here, because I'm sure they have also really interesting insight. My feeling is that most people don't care about Venezuela. Most countries don't really care. And people are using it as a flagship for whatever message they want to send across. So for a lot of right-wing governments, even in Latin America, came to power when they, like Bolsonaro and also Duque in Colombia, and their message was, and also Macri was, we don't, like, they were running against Venezuela. It was like, we don't want Venezuela. And that was a platform that was successful because people were seeing what was happening in Venezuela. And the same thing is with the left, like people are also using Venezuela and saying, okay, this is because of US imperialism, etc., and we need to gain our independence. So people are using Venezuela, but that's not really helping the solution on the ground. And you say Cuba is helping Venezuela. I think it's more the other way around. I think Venezuela has been helping Cuba for the last 20 years, sending them free oil, which, last thing I want to say, and then I pass over to my colleagues. The crisis in Venezuela was denied by the government since it started in 2014 until early this year. It was denied. It didn't exist. And that's also one of the reasons I decided to create this black and white, because these stage scenes, because while we were shooting it, the public health minister was on a PR tour saying Venezuela had the best healthcare system in the world. And the disparity between what the state was saying and what I was seeing was so big that I said, okay, then I told my protagonist, you must be amazing actors if the official narrative is true. Actually, the whole country is we're all great actors, and it's a big stage. So let's play with this idea, and let's involve it in the film, and let's bring let's bring your stories onto the stage. And it was a way of playing with this idea instead of juxtaposing state officials saying. But The sanctions, the economic sanctions against Venezuela, because the first sanctions started already in 2014, but they were all the first ones were against corrupt Venezuelan officials, that basically they couldn't open bank accounts in Europe or in the US, or assets were frozen. Then there were sanctions in 2015, which had to do with the reissuing of debt, but that had actually no effect on the economy, because already the parliament was dominated by the opposition, and new debt would not have been authorized or sanctioned anyways. And also the conditions were really bad, because the country had the bonds were, Venezuela was paying very high prices because it was already very high in debt. So it didn't affect the economy. Now in 2019, yes, there are specific sanctions that are targeting the economy and having direct implications, and are also very damaging and having also consequences on the population. That there is a crisis. But there's someone to blame. So it's all in the end, it's how you use the information, and each side uses the information, and especially in international politics. But I'm sorry, I already talked too much, but there's also one more thing I want to add to your question, and it's the UN representative to Venezuela, who was there just 2 weeks ago. He said Venezuela is the most neglected international crisis at the moment. They've only received 1/3 of the funds they wanted for humanitarian aid. And he said, Venezuela is the most neglected. No one cares about Venezuela. People talk about, look how much, all the other, but Venezuela, no one really cares. I'm sorry for extending so long.
Just a comment that in the meantime, actually, the United States was buying oil from Venezuela up until this year. So that was during the whole time of the Chavez era. It was that sort of, diplomatically they were speaking against each other. But U.S. was buying oil until the beginning of this year. So there is the level of discourses and the level of trade. And on the level of trade, because it was U.S. interest to buy oil, they did it during the whole time of the crisis. I believe that what moves the United States in this respect is basically the oil, because Venezuela has the largest oil reserves on earth. So it's supposed to be even bigger than Saudi Arabia. So it's a huge amount of oil reserve. So that is definitely in the focal point of U.S. geopolitical interest, and they do pretty much to move things around. So I would say that there was a background U.S. involvement also in what happened in January, February, when Juan Guaido stepped up, and also in April. Then there was some sort of trying to mobilize Venezuelan society, but did not really go out well. So I don't know if you want to add anything else. U.S. is more into the point. The European Union, as always, is a bit less decided on what stances to take.
Yes, briefly, I think the United States from the beginning it's not interested in the better situation in Venezuela. I agree that the United States use Venezuela as well a lot of other actors. Yes, there are wide-scale sanctions in effect now, at the moment, and it makes the situation even worse. So, and the regime is standing. So the population situation is getting worse.
Do we have questions more? I'm just waiting if somebody else has one, but if not, then fine.
I would just like to say that Hungary has brought some people who could prove they have some Hungarian antecedents, which helped a few hundreds of Venezuelans for ideological reasons, that we do help other Hungarians. This sounded well. and it was really lucky that we needed that. So, and it's awful that, thank you for making that film and letting us know a little about it.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then I would like to thank our panelists for sharing their thoughts. I would like to thank for the movie as well. I think it was a really profoundly impactful movie, and I think I would leave with just the idea that we've been talking about immense human suffering, and then on the one hand, and on the other hand, we've been talking about immense wealth, in a sense, the wealth of oil and the wealth of the elites. And I think this kind of juxtaposition of the two and how the immense wealth actually makes people poor is very important to understand. And I think it was a really evocative example for this. So thank you very much for your participation. Thank you for sticking around so late, and good night.